parents and as teachers facing more strike misery, teachers now walking out more than half of England's 22,000 schools set to be fully or partially closed today as the National Education Union brings in its industrial action. And we can turn to Joint General Secretary of the NEU, Kevin Courtney, who I believe is joining me from a picket line in Bristol outside the Bristol Cathedral School. Thank you for coming on, Mr. Courtney. The mood of your colleagues on the picket line, how would you describe it? Good morning.
Good morning, Nick. Very pleased to be with you. The mood of members on the picket line is determined. They need to see a change in schools in our country. They're telling me about the recruitment and retention difficulties in the schools here in Bristol, but also I'm hearing these stories on a national basis. We're hearing of chemistry classes taught by people who don't have any qualifications in chemistry. We're hearing of physics classes that are only taught half the week because and the children are having to do self-study for the other half of the week. And now we're seeing that even in primary schools where they had been hitting their targets for recruitment, they are badly missing targets for recruitment in primary schools as well. And our members are saying that there is a question both of pay and of funding of schools that they want the government to address.
Can I address the timing of your industrial action? I don't need to tell you that it is approaching, or in some instances the GCSE exams have begun, A-levels are perhaps a week or so away. I'm taking a lot of calls from angry students and indeed angry parents. This is not the time to strike. Why so close to the end of a young man or woman's 5 or 7 years of education? Mr. Courtney.
We're putting dispensations in place to ensure that our GCSE and A-level classes are having revision today. They're getting ready for those exams because we recognise the point that you're making. We always regret the disruption that our action is causing, the disruption not just to education, but also to parents' home and working lives. But our point is there is a wider disruption. If your physics class is not taught for half of the lessons, if your maths class doesn't have a maths teacher, I was hearing this on a demonstration in London recently, a primary class where the teacher had left at Christmas and by the 15th of March there's still no replacement for that teacher in place. That is disruption every day.
But this
and
is
we're
more
trying
disruption.
to get the government to put right.
I'm sorry to talk over you. I am hearing from students where there is no provision. I'm sure your union has made its best efforts, but there are schools where the pupils have no provision whatsoever as they enter this key period. I put to you again, why could this industrial action not take place in September or January or wherever it might be? Why so close to exams? Mr. Courtney.
Well, I'd like to ask, to put the question back to you, why hasn't Gillian Keegan solved this dispute? We've solved it in Wales. I met with Jeremy Miles, the minister in Wales, and there was an offer of a fully funded pay rise which has resolved the dispute.
But why should
Gillian
the pupils
Keegan's turning
suffer?
her back on this situation.
But why should the pupils suffer?
We are trying to put in place, as I say, dispensations to ensure that children can revise for the exams during this period, and that's what we're putting in place as widespread as we can across schools in England. But when that disruption is there every week, Nick, somebody has to stand up and say the government has to put this right. And the government is just turning its back on this generation of children. They are not investing in them. They appointed Sir Kevin Collins as a COVID recovery czar. He ended up resigning because they ignored the plan that he developed. They are ignoring the needs of this generation of children.
Well, we mentioned the children or the pupils. Just to reflect a little of what they're saying, this is an A-level student, Shimon in Edgware, who had this message for you and your union colleagues.
Of course, it's extremely understandable, is that teachers, they do need to put food on their table. And, of course, it's almost selfish for a whole group of students to prioritise their own needs over the actual livelihood of a teacher. However, some teachers may not realise that they're looking after their own livelihood, but they're affecting the livelihood of other students.
What would you say to 18-year-old Shimon? And I assure you, Mr. Courtney, there have been other parents and pupils who say they have no provision. Mr. Courtney?
I would recognise that. I would want to talk with Shimon about these questions. I'd want to talk to him about how we can put revision in place and how he can work today on revision for his exam classes.
He's only got days to go. But you know that better than I. We're counting down the days, Mr. Courtney.
Absolutely. But I just need to put back to you, Nick, there are physics classes that have had lessons not taught for half the week for the whole of the school year. Imagine that level of disruption. That is not one day of lack of teaching. That is 100 days of lack of teaching that's already happened because the government isn't investing in this generation of children. This is a last resort for us. We have taken every other step that we could.
We have 9 days strike action this year, Mr. Courtney. I'd hardly call that a last resort. You've been out 9 days.
Well, that's not true, actually. There have been 6 days of strike action by the NEU, and any individual school has only been affected by 4 of them.
Putting unions together.
This is the 5th.
I mean, you've had 6 days then. I'm sorry, I've included another union there. My apologies. 6 days. Let's make that point again. I mean, it's not taken with great... You've done it 6 times, Mr. Courtney.
Any individual school affected by 4 of those, but we have taken those 6 days of strike action. We used those, we got into talks with the government, but the offer the government made in those talks was pitiful, frankly. It wasn't funded, and head teachers told us they would have to make cuts in order to pay it, and it wasn't enough to reverse the problems with teacher recruitment and retention. So we put that offer to our members, and they rejected it in huge numbers.
Well, on that, lastly, and I think I've got one more question with you. Yes, it was rejected, but I have to put it to you, Mr. Courtney, it was a £1,000 bonus for the previous financial year, 4.5% rise from this year onwards, guaranteed starting salaries of £30,000. The taxpayer contribution to a teacher's pension is 23.68%. To the average private sector, it's 6 to 8%. Do you expect? And now the exams are being disrupted. Don't you think a lot of my listeners are saying that's not a bad deal, Mr. Courtney?
So, as you say, the offer they made was lower than the going rate in the private sector. And we took to Gillian Keegan the evidence, not just from the union, but from the National Foundation for Education Research, from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, from the group called Public First, a vaguely right of centre think tank, if you think in those terms, all of them saying that teacher pay has declined compared relatively to other pay in the economy. And all of them saying that is part of the problem with teacher recruitment and retention. Right. The government needs to recognise that and create a correction in teacher pay, and it needs to fund it properly if we're going to have the physics teachers, the chemistry teachers, the primary teachers that our children need.
Lastly, Mr. Courtney, do you imagine these strikes could run into the next school year or even the next calendar year?
There has to be a possibility of that. The government requires us to reballot every 6 months, and we will start a reballot soon. If I were the government, I would be worried about us continuing strike action, which is talking about funding and teacher recruitment and retention difficulties into their general election year.
That's the mood of your colleagues currently, is it? You sense they are not for standing down?
That is my sense of it, yeah. They think that they have invested some energy, some time, some money. They've invested in this, and they want to see the government change for the benefit of the children in our schools.
Grateful for your time today. Kevin Courtney is Joint General Secretary of the NEU, the relevant union, National Education Union, and was speaking on a picket line outside Bristol Cathedral.